and I am very grateful for the Sarah and Suhaib Abbasi program at Stanford for inviting me to this very meaningful conversation. And I look forward to sharing more during the hour that follows. What I've been assigned is to speak a little bit about the history, laying the groundwork for the Ashura commemoration, and of course speak about the significance of Hussein and Shi'i theology as it relates to liberation, social justice struggles that we see in our world today. So I'm just going to start off a little bit about the history, which I'm sure that our attendees are well aware of. It has been studied a lot, but there are four specific aspects that I'd like us to ponder upon, reflect upon as we look at Shia theology and what role Hussein and his mission plays, and especially with context or relation to how that translates into solidarity with social justice movements in the world today. So the history in a nutshell, or very, very briefly, is what took place on the 10th of October, 1010, 680 of the Common Era. Or in the Islamic calendar, that was the 10th day of the first month of the Islamic calendar, which is Muharram, in the year 61 AH. So just for a context, we are today on the 7th day of Muharram in the year 1443 AH. So that's where we are. We're looking at an episode around 1380 years before. It's only 50 years after the demise of the Prophet, so not even half a century has passed, and you find that the Umayyad ruler Yazid has come to power, and he is asking for an allegiance from the grandson of the Prophet, Hussain bin Ali. The latter declines to pay allegiance. How the Shia theologians and historians see it is that it was a call or a demand from power to condone their actions. And that is something that Hussain bin Ali could not do. And his epic statement was, mithli la yuba'u mithleh. Someone who stands for the values that I do cannot condone the actions of the Umayyad regime. So this is how the saga played on. And eventually, when he found out that when Yazid found out that Hussein was not going to pledge allegiance, he ordered the governor of Medina, where Hussein used to live, to arrest him, kill him even. So he had to flee Medina. So you have a bit of the refugee situation in the story of Hussein as well, because it seems that in the very midst of the night, he had to get his family together, his children, his women, a few supporters, and exit Medina. He does that. And then he comes to Mecca because he wants safe haven there, until he realizes in the month of Zul-Hijjah that there have been assassins appointed to kill him right during the peak of the Hajj season. So he then leaves Mecca and then starts wandering, coming towards supporters, and supporters in Kufa, a city in Iraq, are sort of awaiting him and want him to come. But he's not able to make it to Kufa because Yazid's army arrests him halfway through his march, refuses to give him safe passage. Eventually, he's rounded up in this desert, which is known as Karbala, which is famous city today, was not so famous at that time. And he has been given the ultimatum. It's either you pledge allegiance or you are killed. And he stood by what he believed in. And eventually he was killed with his supporters who enumerate between 70 to 120, who were faced with an army of at least tens of thousands. And they didn't stand a chance, of course. They were brutally massacred. And that happened on the day of Ashura, which will be commemorated by Shias all over the world this coming Thursday. And then the very next day, the women and children were made captives, and they were made to march a distance of about 520 kilometers, all the way, 550 miles, all the way to Damascus, so that they could be imprisoned there and presented before Yazid. So that's like in a nutshell the history that we're looking at when we talk about Ashura or we talk about Imam Hussein alayhi salam. But like I said, there are a few points that have impacted Shia theology or resonate with Shia theology in this narrative. which are of particular importance to the liberation and social justice movements in the world today. The first being, of course, justice. The whole saga is warped around the theme of justice. Now, we know in Islam, justice or al-adl is one of the names of God. So it's very connected to theology. It's also practical theology, because so much about the Quran, so many verses of the Quran implore Muslims and faithful people to conduct their manner with justice. Even if they were trying to get two people together or to work as arbitrators between two warring groups, they'd have to act with justice. And there's so much that has been talked about in the practical theology of justice as well among the Muslims. But to believe in justice as a very foundational tenet is something that started to develop in the 9th century. When you have theologians actually looking at justice as a very important component of Islamic faith. And that's where you had the Adliya group. So you had a group that insisted on justice, that God is just, he expects us to work with justice, and that is why the ruler must rule with justice. On the other side, you had a kind of a theology which shied away from associating attributes to God. And they said God can do whatever he wants to do, and it would be wrong to impose justice on God. So that was where you find a little bit of a dichotomous conversation going on around the adl. But the Shia and Mu'tazili theologians were known as the Adliya. And even today, when you look at Shia religious education, adl is actually highlighted as one of the tenets of faith, and grounding the belief in one God as the one God who is just. So justice has a lot to do with it. And I think it unfolds in politics today, in the way we see the world today. We see many Muslim minorities, many Muslims being oppressed in the world, and yet Muslim majority countries shy away from making statements and don't come out openly to support those marginalized and oppressed Muslims, because it is deeply rooted whether people should stand up for justice or not, or whether they should just allow this to happen because this is one of the ways God is testing them. So you have the Qadariya, the Mujabbira, those who think that this is all ordained and this has to happen. And then you have the Adliya school of theology, which says, no, you need to question. You need to make sure that justice is served. So that's one aspect that Hussein's narrative brings about in theology, and of course translates very much to how Muslims understand their duty towards social justice in the world today. Another factor which I think is so important, and that is adopting a kind of a non-intimidation policy, not to be intimidated by power. So the narrative of Hussein highlights this. He's known famously as a person who said, the person who had the audacity to say no to the tyrant. So a non-intimidation policy against power is something that is ingrained in the ways the Shias understand their theology. For example, you have things which are interpreted in the Quran where God talks about that in Allah la yuhibbu al-jahra bis-su'. God does not like talking loudly or making a scene or making noise, let's just say. Illa man dhulim, except for the person who's been oppressed. So when a person is oppressed, the Quran actually subscribes and condones that person's action in making noise. So making noise is also very intricately connected to Shia theology. It actually promotes speaking up, not being intimidated, making noise, calling people to justice, questioning that, which again reflects against the mainstream theology, which thinks that all this is happening for a reason. There is a fatalistic view about qada and qadar. This is destiny. And if we speak against it, we are speaking against what God destined for his people. So there is a little bit of a theological component in the way I think Muslims react to what is happening in the world today. But in Hussein's saga, you find that there is this not to be intimidated by power, and to speak up. In fact, one of his letters or one of his sermons that he gave Hussein en route to Karbala, at I think at a place called Bayda, where he stopped and he said, God will hold you responsible if you see a power not serving the creatures of God, or who is oppressing the creatures of God. And he doesn't say, he says, Ibadallah, the creatures of God or the servants of God. He doesn't sort of specify Muslims or non-Muslims. And he says, God will take you to account for not rising against that person. So this rising against power is also something which is very intricately woven into the way Shias understand their theology, and that translates into how Muslims respond to what we see the social justice movements today. I have two very short things to share with you in the same grain, and I have 4 more minutes, and I'm hoping I can do it within that time. The third aspect, that a theological aspect that emerges from Hussein's narrative, is that of documenting and commemorating stories of oppression. And I'm saying this because for the ways Shia interpret the Quran, they look at the Quran among many things, of course, a code of practice, a book of theology and spirituality, all of those things. But along with that, the Quran is viewed in Shia theology as a document of the oppressed people, a documentation of oppressed narratives. The largest surah or chapter in the Quran is the chapter of Baqarah, the second chapter, the cow. And that revolves, the whole topic and theme, it revolves around this young man who was killed by his cousin. And how that story unfolded without going deeper into it, but it's connected to a murder. You have Surat Buruj, you have many places in the Quran where God talks about the Ashab al-Ukhdud, the people who sat around a pit of fire and watched Christians being thrown into that pit of fire because of their love for one God, and by the pagans. So that is again documented. I mean, why am I going here and there? Of course, the murder of infants, female infants, Surah Takwir, is documented. This is what they used to do. So there is so much in the Quran that talks about documenting oppression against minorities and then commemorating that oppression, reliving it again and again. And this is where there are modern rifts between the Shia and the non-Shia, where the Shia are sometimes called heretics because of their commemorations. There are those politically correct moves where people come up and say, well, that was a part of history, but what's the point of reliving it again and again and again? And this is where the Shia practice draws from its theology of looking towards the Quran as a book of documenting oppression and also commemorating it, because the Quran keeps saying, "Wadhkur fil kitab, wadhkur fil kitab." Keep remembering this book and the episodes in the book. So this is how it aligns with the theology, and of course, not letting go. We commemorate the Holocaust. We will commemorate George Floyd's murder. We will look at what is happening in Afghanistan today and not let it go. And that needs to keep coming up. For the Shias, because of the narrative of Hussein, it is very much a theological issue. The last thing that I'll say, and I have 2 minutes, is of course the theology of lament. This is also something that is ingrained or is drawn from, hinges around the narrative of Hussain bin Ali. It is a sort of a mobilizing of pain, the lament culture. Lamenting is something that began with the Prophet mourning his 18-month-old son, then followed by the Prophet's daughter Fatima when she mourned her father, and then it continues. But especially with Hussein, so much of what happened to him and his family, which I'm so eager to hear from Professor Akbar, is documented and is intertwined with the arts, with the literary productions, with the eulogies, with the way people dress in Black. It's like a culture. Like when you go for Hajj, everybody's in white. When you come to Ashura, everybody's in Black. So it's this way of mobilizing pain and recording history, which ends up being marginalized by the hegemony and molding it into this lament that is recited in different episodes and in different ways, and which carries the hues of the cultures that it passes through. So you have a multicultural, multilingual adaptation of the story of Karbala, because it is mobilizing pain and embodying that pain to be able to preserve the history of a group which considers itself marginalized. And of course, I don't have to say this, because we've been watching tweets from yesterday, what happened in Afghanistan. And if you've been seeing those videos, you're seeing one of the ways in which the new government is iterating itself is by taking down those flags that have Ya Hussein written on them and then replacing them with their own flags. So I think it's very connected, lamenting either through flags, through poetry, through artistic visual arts or literary features, is very connected and deeply rooted in Shia theology. And I think this lament is also used by by Black Americans, to advance all those narratives that were not documented by white supremacist history. It is a very important mode of preserving what happened to a marginalized group, and then iterating it, commemorating it, makes it, protects it from erasure even in modern times.
This is a perfect segue to ask Mahjabeen a question about her dissertation, which she wrote on sacred female activism and the sermon of Sayyida Zainab. Please tell us more about the role of gender as it relates to the Karbala story, as it relates to Imam Hussein.
I resonate with you, Farah, in thanking Professor Akbar for those two pieces of poetry, very beautiful. And again, such a gendered observation, a mother mourning for her 6-month-old baby. So thank you so much for sharing that. The dissertation that I worked on was actually the Sermon of Fatima. And I think gender is very much, the narrative of Hussein is very gender inclusive, as it is age inclusive, as it is race inclusive. It's a very inclusive model of how people come together in solidarity for a common goal to rise against injustice. So I think when people talk about Imam Hussein, and I've heard this and I've seen quotes from international political leaders, Nelson Mandela, Gandhi, everybody talking about how they draw inspiration from Imam Hussein, and such a revolutionary figure, not just for the Muslims, but also for the larger human community. When I see all this, I think to myself, like mother, like son. So my work in my dissertation was on his mother and Fatima, when she stood in front of the caliph of her time, just 10 days after the demise of her father. So what happens to Hussein is 50 years down the road, and what happens to his mother, Fatima, is right 10 days, just there, 10 days after her father, the prophet, passed away, and her lands have been usurped by the government. And she stands there in the mosque, which is a public place, which is a place that the prophet bought from the orphans in Medina so that he could build a mosque there. She is addressing a male-dominated audience of mostly the Ansar and the Muhajirin, the helpers and those who migrated to Medina. And she stands there with this theological confidence and her understanding of the Quran. And she asked the caliph, where is it in the book of God that, fi kitabillah an taritha abak wala arithu abi, that you inherit your father and I don't inherit my father. So it was a classic statement or a demonstration of truth speaking to power, and the truth was being spoken at that time by a woman, which was very alarming in that kind of a society. And she was anywhere between 18 to 23 years old. So you have that age thing as well, a young adult talking to somebody who's like 60 years plus, and addressing them about practical laws of inheritance with her confidence in her theology. So if Hussein is revolution, then Fatima is the mother of revolution. So I think he's learned so much of how to do what he is doing in Karbala because of the tarbiyah, or the upbringing of the mother. So I think it's very gender related. And even going on after Karbala, like we see the tactics of knowledge formations by the hegemony, it's things are chosen, who says what, even in media reports today, what sort of news is being shared at a common platform, at a public platform. What we hear in the news, is it what really transpired, or is it what has been decorated for us or created for us by the people who are in power? So something like that happened even in 680 of the Common Era. When Yazid had done this, he realized what had happened. It was a massacre. It was bloodshed of, like we heard, babies as young as 6 months old, the companions of the prophets who were in their 80s, and they were killed, and the people were beheaded. The bodies were trampled upon under the hooves of horses, that the kind of things that you hear, the barbaric treatment. And after that, I mean, I can't even call it a battle, because that would be the end of a battle. But after that, you see that the tents of the women and children are being terrorized. They're set ablaze, and they are made to run out to seek refuge. And then they're, put into chains and taken. So this entire machinery of the Umayyad regime at that time to sort of cover up what happened in the middle of the desert. Nobody would find out. There were reports like, oh, there was a rebellion from someone who didn't like Yazid's regime, and he revolted, and then the king's army sort of crushed the revolt. It was Zainab, it was the sister, it was all these women who were made captives and who were made to walk to Damascus. Every town that they passed, they informed people of what had happened in Karbala, and they used lament to do that. They used sermons to do that. They used poetry to do that. So there is this gender aspect. In fact, it becomes the role of these women and children becomes pivotal in preserving what happened over there. Even the maqatil that we have, or the narrations that we have of what happened in Karbala, have come to us through these women and children. So the gender aspect of this entire narrative cannot be ignored, cannot be undermined. And just like, the mother of Hussein had stood in front of the caliph of her time and said, this is wrong what you're doing, and there is no theological basis for you to take away what belongs to me. The sister of Hussein does a similar thing. She is there in Damascus. She stands there, in pain, because she is hurt, not just physically, but also emotionally. Physical hurt, of course, being bound in chains and made to walk more than 500 miles, no food, no water, and standing there with the hurt of all her family being massacred, and she's being challenged theologically. She's being told, how do you see what God did to you? So she's being asked that theological question. God, this did to you and to your family. And even in that moment of despair, obvious despair, or that moment of pain, she's able to keep herself theologically grounded and turn back and say, Ma ra'aytu illa jamila. I didn't see anything but beauty from God. But if you're asking about the murderers of my family, it is you and your men who did that. So you have this clarity for a woman in that position that anybody would have lost their cool. So she's standing there and she's saying this, and she makes this phenomenal statement at that time. She says, Kit kaidak wasa'sayak. She talks to power. Yazid is in front of her. And she says, get your allies together, get your weapons together, scheme your scheme, plot your plots. Wallahi la tamhu dhikrana. But I swear by God that you will not be able to obliterate what happened to us. You will not be able to wipe off, what happened to us, and we will be remembered. I find this so phenomenal because I've had the privilege, the honor, to be able to lead the Arba'in walks between Najaf and Karbala, something that is commemorated annually. especially after the downfall of the Ba'athist regime in Iraq. The people have come out in their millions to pay their respects. I've seen this slogan being, chanted. It's become a mantra. What Zainab said has become a mantra for the Shia. It's a mantra of resilience. It's a mantra of non-intimidation. It's a mantra of you will not push us to the margins. We will come out from the margins and we will make this noise. So I just find that is just so beautiful, that the gendered aspect, it's intertwined in the story, because for every martyr that died in Ashura, you had a woman associated with him, a sister, a mother, a partner, was associated, and that woman took it upon herself as she was made captive to make sure that what happened was actually advertised and was actually said. And I think their march became a disruption of peace. Again, something that I think resonates with movements of Martin Luther King. Him being arrested and put into the Birmingham jail was because his protest was seen as disturbing of peace. But whose peace? Peace of the white supremacists. What he was doing, what he was saying, was disturbing the peace of a hegemony. And I think what Zainab did, what Fatima did, was disturbing a peace, but a peace that was the peace of the supremacists. It was not the peace of the masses. It was not the peace of the oppressed. It was not the peace of humanity. So I could go on. Like I said, this was my dissertation. I passionately believe in the power of female activism, and especially in the place of theologically inspired female activism. And as you know, that women's studies in Islam, in religion, especially in Islam here in the West, is also very overdetermined by Islamophobic concepts, where people think that we need to resort to secularism, or we need to look outside religion for female empowerment. And I think I'm one of those few people who work on looking at theologically inspired women who raised their voices against injustice, who came out of their homes as a sign of social activism, as a solidarity for those who are marginalized and oppressed. So yeah, absolutely. I think it's so important that all that emotion, that hurt, that pain, that love for God. I mean, Zainab standing there and saying, "I've only seen beauty in the episode of Karbala." It speaks about a profound love for God, to be able to mobilize all these emotions to take a stand against injustice, at least for me, is very phenomenal. And I argue that it can be very inspirational for what we are going through in a broken world right now.
So Mahjabeen, if we may, to invite you to reflect on how your subject of study, Fatima Hussein, how this influences your interfaith work.
Thank you, Robert, for that question. And I think if you permit me, Farah, I can see here in the chat another question that you suggested that we take, and that is about the universal appeal of the events in Karbala and Imam Hussein, such as the Iraqi Catholics and Husseini Brahmins. So if it's okay with you, I'd like to sort of, put those two questions together, and because I think it is in the interreligious vein that we're going to talk about. So yeah, absolutely. The work that I do with gender, the work that I do with Shia history has, and especially the narrative that we're discussing today, the narrative of Ashura and Karbala, I think has a lot to do with bringing people with differences together, in solidarity. It has a lot to do, because when you study conflict resolutions, even in places, places like Israel and Palestine, it's the mothers of those who lost their children come together in those peaceful resolutions. So I think pain has this power of bringing people together, or a narrative of pain has this power of bringing people together. I mean, this past year, the pandemic has sort of brought people together. People from those who do not have access to vaccination, those who did not have access to medical insurance. It has sort of brought these people together under that common umbrella, the solidarity of who will be listening to their voices and how will their cases be brought forward. So I think it has a lot to do with that kind of universal appeal, and especially for Imam Hussein. And Professor Akbar, if I can sort of take some of your encouragement from what you said, what Josh Maliha Abadi in the 1950s Urdu poet said, "Insaniyat ko berdar to ho lene do, har qaum pukaregi, hamare hain Hussein." Let humanity awaken from its slumber. Then you will see every group saying, I want Hussein. I want that message. I want that kind of a life. So it has that universal appeal. For me to be able to see that diversity, that coming together of religions, coming together of genders, coming together of cultures, has been most profound in my pilgrimage trips when we go to Iraq. I've seen bishops walking the 50-mile walk. I've seen rabbis doing the 50-mile walk. I've come across, on that 3 days, we usually take 3 days to do the walk from Najaf to Karbala. And we pass through all these hospitable stations set up from almost every part of the world. I found somebody who had come from Denmark and making us, strudel waffles in the morning and saying, this is how we do it in Denmark. And we're doing it here for the guests of Imam Hussein, for those who remember liberty and justice. So just, the culinary arts coming together through food, through language, through just a nudge and saying, I walk for Hussein and I walk for Hussein, even though you don't understand the language that they're speaking. But I think this is how it brings them together. For Husseini Brahmins, being from India myself, I know that they have this rich culture of producing poetry and of hosting these Ashura commemorations. So they come together, they recite the poetry, they host people who've been walking, and this march of the women and children of Karbala, or the women and children of Hussein, are emulated and embodied worldwide. You'll see from New York to all the way on the other part of the world, people coming out on the streets to commemorate what they did. So I think all of this sort of gives you that platform, where that what is happening to the minorities, the pain of the minorities is authentic. So many times people in the margins have to speak up just to say that we're hurting, and for that hurt and that pain to be considered authentic by the majority. Otherwise, it's just dismissed as, no, you don't feel it because you're in a darker body or because you're in that part of the world. But pain is genuine. Every human being feels it. Everybody bleeds red. Everybody bleeds red. And I think this is the beautiful appeal that brings people together, that pain narrative, that authenticity to what marginalized people are feeling, and the authenticity of the experiences, stories, narratives, histories of what has happened to the marginalized. Centering that. And I think that is what brings religions together, brings races together and genders together in solidarity. And for me, I am yet to see something grander than the narrative of Ashura doing this, bringing all those people together on that platform for social justice. So it absolutely informs my interreligious work. It absolutely informs that kind of research.
Someone asked about the concept of Imam al-Mahdi and sort of the relationship with that of the sort of 21st century. So a lot of people have been sort of like in a black comedy joking like, oh, it's the apocalypse, the end of times. And it's like sort of we're all living in that strange, historical moment where everybody's having this sort of question mark looming over our heads. So I want to ask you if you encountered any sort of eschatological, messianic sort of end time themes that somehow the Karbala tragedy has yet to be unfolded, that there's an ending to this that will come, that there will be some kind of victory will be heralded sooner than later. So can you comment if you encountered any of those themes, that something is yet to come? Do you find that in the devotional lores you study?
Very briefly, I think, yes, the messianic, the eschatological understanding of the coming of a Mahdi, this global leader whose mission will be to establish justice, I think, again, is very connected to the theological understanding of the Husseini narrative. You have, scholars who've said, Kul yawmin Ashura wa kul ardin Karbala. Every city in the world is Karbala. And every day is Ashura, because it's this dichotomy of power and truth, and that constant struggle between will power serve the people, or will power obstruct liberty? And who will then stand up or rise against that obstruction of liberty? So it's a constant battle, and the understanding that it just didn't finish, in that day or that age, but it is continuing. It is every day. And I think this is not just connected into a devotional practice that Akbar spoke to us about, but it's also part of spiritual literature. So you have the supplications that have been taught by the 12 Imams, the 12 Imams of the 12 Shias. And one which is recited, I think, globally every Friday is this, this demanding from God. When will these massacres be avenged? When will the minorities who've been crushed brought to justice? So that question, connected to the coming of the government of justice. So it's all sort of in anticipation of a government of justice that empowers the minorities, that empowers the muted voices over the centuries. So it's connected to that kind of a spiritual, devotional, spiritual rather, literature. And also in the nights of Ramadan Kareem, if you go to, groups of Shia practitioners who are fasting that day and come together for their iftar, among the recitations of the Quran and among the prayers, they're also repeating statements of a supplication known as al-iftitah, and that is also very sort of hopeful, where it says, God, we complain to you as your servants, we complain to you, we are minorities, and the majority has pushed us in the margin. There are people protesting against us, and we don't have supporters, we don't have leaders, and they've sort of put us aside. So there's that recurring theme of who will support the voiceless, who will center the minorities, who will bring justice to the world. So it's sort of intertwined even in devotional practices, spiritual practices, important nights of the day, of the year, lunar year, Ramadan, Eid. All these days are where people will gather at Imam Hussein's shrine and pray for the coming of that government, So yeah, I said I would be brief, so I'll stop there. It is connected, sort of that image of Mahdi and eschatology.
But I think this viewer asked a question that I was thinking about and have been struggling with and trying to understand this phenomenon in Afghanistan. And that is essentially, you're telling a story here that emphasizes continuity in tradition and values across geography and across temporal divides. But this viewer asks, what about the 21st century? Are there particular features of Karbala that are particular to this moment, to the present, and having to do with social justice? And to what extent does this have the capacity to address contemporary challenges? And for me, I think I was thinking about the theme of revolution, so important, and some of the African thinkers have examined the image, the figure of Hussein as revolutionary. And I think maybe if I can distort the language somewhat of the questioner here, to what extent is there kind of revolutionary capacity in the commemoration of Hussein that we could draw upon today in our contemporary practice? And this viewer asks particularly about the opportunity for activism and for anti-imperial mobilization. So a great question, I think, dovetailed with what I want to ask.
For me, I think to think about that question about the peculiarities of commemoration of Karbala in context of the 21st century, I think the first obvious thing that jumps out to me is the pilgrimage aspect of the commemoration. And we know that throughout spiritual traditions and religious traditions, you have this this notion of actually going to the place where history occurred. So you can embody that history and you can feel the vibes of that history. We knew that the Buddhist monks used to travel to those places so that they could, gain the spirituality where their saints were. And the same happens even for African American history, when you go to these prisons or these places where African slaves were tortured in the Midwest. People who go to these kinds of sort of pilgrimage, they come back with a different understanding than what is available in textbooks or in literature. Actually embodying it, witnessing the site of history where that conflict unfolded. So this pilgrimage aspect of going to the place of the conflict and embodying the vibes of what happened in there is something about Karbala that I think resonates with how minorities in the 21st century sort of connect the larger people to what they've experienced. The other thing that I think which is demonstrated in these commemorations is the celebration of diversity, not just tolerance of diversity. So it's not tolerating other people, but it is celebrating the coming together of different people. So not only in the saga of Karbala, you have Imam Hussein, who is a very revered personality in Islam. He places his cheek on the cheek of two individuals during the day of Ashura. So one, he places his cheek on the cheek of Ali al-Akbar, his elder son Ali, who was killed. And he places his cheek on the cheek of Ali because he loves, and he says, he recites his poetry, and he says, ad-dunya ba'daka al-afa. He says, Ali, after you've been killed, the world has become a dark place for me. Of course, it's a father and son, connection. But he does this for a Turkish slave. One of his slaves who was from Turkey, a servant who was from Turkey, who dies that day. And he does this, putting his cheek on the cheek of the servant, from another class, and the servant starts reciting that poetry, men mithli, who is like me today, who you have the grandson of the prophet putting his cheek on my cheek. So there's this embracing and celebrating of difference, right? You have African people there, Joan, who had served Imam Hussein since he was a child, and he is beloved to him. You have people who were Christians just 2 weeks ago, Wahab, and then he reversed and he's a Muslim, and there he is right next to him, right? You have people who've come from different factions of life, and they come together. It's not just tolerating people, it's celebrating, it's welcoming. And I think this is what the marches and the commemorations, like the mosque that I go to here in San Jose, we have 4 parallel rooms with people commemorating in Farsi, in Arabic, in Urdu, in English, and then people come out into the parking lot, and there are eulogies being recited in several different formats. For the longest time, I would go to Damascus for Arba'in before this unrest there, and we would see people from different walks of life, just coming together, feeding, giving water, talking about their experiences. And I think it's that moment of celebrating diversity. So I think I'll stop there. And for this answer, the pilgrimage aspect and then that celebration of diversity is something that I think is very welcome in the 21st century.